Well, folks, thanks for tuning in again today, and going to be hitting on a number of stories, some of those of which we have been a lead here and breaking some stories, mainstream media picking them up a couple of days after. So thanks for the insights again and some of the tips that you're giving me in terms of saying, chase down this story or chase down that story. I'm in a different office today. I hope you don't mind the background, and moving right into it. The name's Andrea Stricker. And the name David Albright, probably not household names to you, but they're in the news today. Andrea Stricker is she's director of the Foundation of Defense and Democracy, which is apparently a very well-heeled institution that has a lot of influence on government policies when it comes to defense. And David Albright is a top physicist, and he's president of the Institute for Scientific and International Security. Both of them and their large agencies are saying that the U.S. is absolutely on the right course in terms of slamming down Iran and stopping discussions until Iran comes forward and says they are not going to pursue a nuclear program. So more agencies now internationally saying, and for institutes, scientific institutes who usually are pretty careful about their language, the David Albright from the Institute for Science and International Security says that the Iranian leaders are liars and cheaters, and you cannot take their word for it. There has to be proof of the fact that they are not going to be pursuing uranium enrichment to the point of being able to create a bomb. You know, kind of goes back to the days, some of you will remember, where President Ronald Reagan, in terms of signing some treaties with Russia at the time, said, yes, it's good to sign the treaties, but you have to have a way to verify. That famous phrase was trust but verify, definitely coming into play. And so the second round of talks now that has emerged, very interesting, and regular watchers and listeners will know here that we say when it comes to markets, kind of take a Warren Buffett approach, stay calm, don't sell when there's a slight drop. And just the announcement, there's a second round of talks, markets globally have shot upwards again in terms of reflecting some optimism there. Though the Strait of Hormuz continues to be closed, one benefit, and we pointed this out last week, is many tankers now that never would go to the U.S. to get their oil and to get replenished are in fact making their way to the U.S. The U.S. definitely benefiting from that. Eventually, what's going to happen, because China relies so much from produce, and especially oil and gas products coming through the Strait of Hormuz, you're going to see China somehow trying to figure out a way to get that strait opened again. So we could see, along with comments now from the EU and from NATO saying, you know what, they maybe should be stepping up and also looking at how they get involved and not leaving it all to the US, as so often happens. Well, the U.S., remember I've been talking for a couple of weeks about, I think there's going to be an emerging new opportunity for auditors, and that's in the area of what's known as forensic audits. Forensic audits are those audits which are done with the intent of looking at possible criminal activity. And in this particular area, we see in Minnesota now, the level of fraud is up in the $300 million range. And this is simply where social agencies, and in many cases daycare centers, are grossly overestimating and overcharging in terms of what they're doing and what they're getting paid for. And it's become such a huge issue in Minnesota that the Governor Waltz, who was planning on running again for governor, has announced he's not going to run again. So taking a lot of heat from that. And in the U.S., Vice President Vance has been appointed to head of a task force on fraud. So they're following federal dollars and where those dollars are winding up and being spent. And they've identified in the state of California 447 hospices. These are hospital care, of course, is much needed for people in their final days and weeks of living. 447 now have been grossly overclaiming the number of people they serve. and how they serve them. And it's fraud to the tune of over $500 million. We'll see if this is going to create problems for the governor of California there. It's certainly going to create, and already creating, problems for those who are claiming to run these hospices, and in many cases they find out they don't exist. So I'm sticking with my prediction that you're going to see an ongoing increase from municipalities, from states, from provinces, from national governments. It's almost like people are waking up and saying, you know what, we've got to be more demanding about tracking the spending of taxpayer dollars. Let's see where that goes. Well, as we've seen, the stock markets have rebounded in a positive way, but price of gas and oil certainly has not, and until the strait opens up again. And so Prime Minister Carney, you remember we announced yesterday, as predicted, he got his majority government. People are wondering what's going to be his first move. And I'm going to give him some credit here, because he is taking off the 10 cent a liter federal tax on gasoline, and taking off the 4 cent per liter tax on diesel. So, you know, we've seen prices, the average prices in the U.S., we've been tracking average prices going up since the start of the Iran conflict. It was averaging out around Canada at about $1.26 a liter, and it's gone up to about average now, $1.76. So there'll be some relief at the pumps. The leader of the opposition, Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative opposition, is saying this is nowhere near close enough, that the government is already taking in way too much on gas taxes and not spending it properly, and they are asking and pushing for even more. It was the Conservatives all along who were suggesting that these taxes need to be reduced, and so it seems that the Prime Minister is feeling some heat from that, and he's lowered it. They're also saying, the Conservatives saying, you got to knock off that 5% on a GST, which is yet another tax that is laden onto your gasoline. And then when you look at some municipalities, for instance, British Columbia, very high, Vancouver, very high taxes. Layer on all these taxes and you see why people are grumbling. And now add to that the fact of the world price of oil because of the Iran dispute. So something we're going to give Prime Minister Carney some points here for finally recognizing that and taking some of the pressure off. There should be more. Well, there's discussion, a little bit of a bromance that's developing here with the president of Finland, Alexander Stubbs, and Prime Minister Carney. They're increasingly becoming buddies, even seen in a photo op yesterday. They're both wearing hockey gear and they're out on the rink. And Stubb is actually floating the idea, and Prime Minister Carney kind of hinting at it, should Canada become part of the EU, part of the European Union? I have a big caution, big yellow flag on that one. The EU, as we know, has been crumbling for decades under its own weight of regulation, trying to get many countries to agree on regulatory overburden, and the EU has just flipped in terms of the immigration with their problems, huge problems with illegal immigration. In a vote last week, we talked about it right here, you heard it first here, to drastically reduce immigration levels and to give EU countries the ability to deport illegals at a far greater rate. And so this is going to be interesting when you get talk of pulling closer to the EU. Canada is not by any means geographically tied to the European market, though of course we do trade there, and really we should be focusing on and working hard on making sure that the US market, where Canada, 75% of Canada's trade goes, gets more attention. So a little bit of caution, I would say, a little bit of a yellow flag if Canada wants to really buy into what is legendary oppressive regulatory regime that flows out of the European Union. And we'll see where that develops. Within Canada, it's good to see provincial competition. And Alberta, again, taking a lead here. We talked about the fact that the Alberta, under Premier Daniel Smith, is introducing ways that you can allow the private sector to do testing for people, diagnostic testing, and people to pay for that on their own, while still making sure, the government makes sure that the lineups, the queue for diagnostic testing for people who don't want to pay, has to continue to be reduced. And now they've got another bill out, Bill 30. They're saying in terms of these regulatory processes for major projects to go ahead, there was some work and discussion going on with the federal government, but the federal government's kind of dropped the ball on that. Alberta proceeding on its own and saying that major projects, 120-day approval processes, they've identified that these drag out for way too long, sometimes for years. They're saying also it has to include environmental and First Nations consultation, but Alberta really showing or believing anyway that they can show that these projects can move along a lot quicker, especially in an age of, as we've seen, talked about this in the show, such a tremendous loss of opportunity for Canada. If they had had the projects that have been really on the books and on the blueprints for building some pipelines and moving oil and gas to places like Europe, we would have been now benefiting in a very significant way, especially with oil being choked off at the Strait of Hormuz. It could have been Canadian, very highly refined products of oil and gas, but we've really squandered. Here we are with the fourth largest reserves in the world, missing a huge opportunity. So Alberta taking the lead there. Let's hope that continues so that we can continue not just to benefit Canadians and First Nations groups from the economic opportunities, but actually can give other countries a lever against countries like Russia. Again, the huge and terrible irony of here you have European countries financing Putin's war on Ukraine by having to buy his energy projects. It could have been Canadian product there. Let's hope these projects continue to move along, and we'll see if there's development on that. And yet another lead position being taken by Alberta. The UN, which is constantly, in the view of many, continues to overburden countries and in the wrong ways. Recently, they had signed something called a 2030 agreement for the year 2030, in which they encouraged about 195 countries signed this agreement that they would simply designate 30% of their landmass area as protected areas. I mean, when you think in terms of Canada, 30% is huge, and the Alberta government is pushing back on the federal government, saying, look, Alberta already has over 60% of their land that is called protected. And again, it's showing the potential. If you sign on to these United Nations deals, which many times are unrealistic, you may not be, in fact, benefiting your country. So Alberta pushing back there with the federal government. And then on a municipal level, in Vancouver, there's a possibility that Vancouver might be moving. It's apparently aggressively pursuing a MLB, a Major League Baseball franchise. They've got the facilities there, but running into, and I think quite rightly, concerns just how much should municipal taxpayers be taxed for funding arenas or other things that benefit multi-million-dollar team owners and multi-million-dollar players. And I don't begrudge players the big salaries in a free market. You make all you want, but getting taxpayers to subsidize these things is coming under increased scrutiny, especially as Ken Sim, the mayor, is looking at an electoral challenges coming up. Really encourage people, if you don't like the thought of you being taxed in some ways, and the cities will always come up with economic reports that say, well, because we've got this franchise, because we put millions and millions of investment into private sector franchises, it brings this much to the city. Those economic studies can be taken a number of different ways, so don't necessarily be swayed by those, and ask the tough questions. Why do you want to support with taxpayer dollars multi-million-dollar owners? And I don't begrudge the owners, multi-million-dollar players, and I certainly don't begrudge those, but let it stand on a free market and let it be supported. Along those lines, the Professional Women's Hockey League getting huge attendance numbers in post-Olympics, where they got a lot of good attention. In Canada and the US, you're going to see pressure there. And already the female players are saying, you know, their top players last year were making about $130,000 in terms of, this is just the top players. Of course, that's way below what the men make, the top players, and the average coming in at around 37 to 45,000 a year. But remember, as these prices need to be set on what the market is demanding, not falsely boosted up. So with the good attendance they're getting, they should be able to get higher salaries, but they should not be financed or subsidized. So good for the women in terms of bringing out big crowds. Well, you heard it first. We are among one of the first to be talking about, in Canada, what really gets us incensed and focused is our maple syrup. We love to talk about that around the world. And remember I talked almost 2 weeks ago about Steve Boudreau, who is one of the top maple syrup makers and distributors in the province of Quebec. And he was getting all kinds of negative flack because it was shown that he was advertising it was 100% pure maple syrup, and in fact quite a bit of that sugar content coming from cane sugar. And he said, oops, sorry, we're going to try and fix that. Now it's been found out that a number of those, or hundreds, I guess, thousands of the cans of maple syrup, when you peel off a certain label, there's another name under there showing that his organization was bringing in product from other than where it was being advertised. So Steve Boudreau continuing to run into problems with his maple syrup. Hopefully that deal will sweeten for him and he can get out of the glue, so to speak. Well, looking internationally, there's increasingly tension between basically the two different political approaches. You can take a socialist left-wing approach, and you can take a more small c conservative center-right approach. You're going to see this being played out in Brazil right now, where Lula, who's the president, he's been president 3 times there now, and he keeps running into problems because his socialist approaches wind up costing lots of money, taxing people and scaring investment away. And he's in a virtual tie now with the center-right party, the Conservative Party, Flavio Bolsonaro, who's the son of a previous president by the same name. And they're coming up to the runoff. They're virtually neck and neck, which will be happening in October. And Lula is promising workers, he's saying, what we're going to do? We're going to shorten the work week, which is fine, but you're all going to get paid the same. So again, the left comes in with promises of that might be unrealistic economically, but all to get the vote. Let's watch for that as that continues to unfold. And offline, what we're seeing is with Gen Z, I like to keep you up to date on what maybe your grandkids or kids are doing or not doing. And definitely the trend that we've been reporting here is continuing, but the fact that being offline is being seen as increasingly cool and not doom scrolling all day long, so much that you're seeing among Gen Z an increase in actual cameras, the kind of cameras that maybe you and I, if you're my age, used to look at, hanging out in bookstores and being more present in kind of public social settings. So we're getting sort of mixed reports, and this would be healthy indeed if it's a trend that's going to continue. We're going to see if it does. Also a trend is more Gen Z are starting to look at the whole area of university education and college education, somewhat in Canada and very significant in the US, where they're coming out with mountains of debt with degrees that maybe are not that relevant and not getting them work. So you're seeing a lot more focus on from Gen Z in terms of how can they be entrepreneurial, how can they get their own hustle going, as it were, how can they be more nimble and equipping themselves and training themselves on how they perceive the markets coming. That's got to be positive. Also a trend, and it's being watched here by retailers and by people in the rental and the property markets, of Gen Z types moving more to smaller cities, less expensive rural areas. So some of the high prices that used to be only seen in the cities now are driving people into more rural settings. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Yesterday I talked about the fact that sometime this week I was going to do a taste test right here, because we were looking at matcha coffee being very popular. It's got about half the caffeine content as regular coffee, and coming from the green leaves of Japan, and it's stone ground, and that has really been taking off in terms of a trend. And then we identified that ube as a drink, UBE, and that's coming from the purple yams of the Philippines. also gaining ground and now breaking through. And these things happen so quickly. It's fun just to try and keep you up to date. Egg coffee, believe it or not. Yes, egg coffee. What you do is Vietnamese coffee, of course, is quite popular. It's very strong. And now there's a way of mixing in egg yolks and condensed milk. And they say it's just a beautiful, sweet, protein-laden drink with lots of caffeine. I'm not going to be testing that one here on the show. It's not really grabbed me. Condensed milk, of course, very sweet and lots of sugar content, but there you go. Watch for egg coffee. Well, you know, we've been talking for the last couple episodes about all the attention Donald Trump was getting when he published a picture, and it looked like a picture portraying himself as Jesus taking care of somebody. He has come back saying it's not at all. It's just a picture of portraying him as a doctor helping people. Well, you can decide what you want in that regard, but I'll tell you what it's done. It's got everybody talking about what? Well, talking about Jesus. The View, for those of you who are watchers of The View, quite a controversy broke out there yesterday when Joy Behar said that actually he was talking about this very thing, and that Jesus never did say he was the Messiah. And of course, co-host Sarah Haynes and the others on The View said, whoa, wait a minute. Of course, Jesus talked about being the Messiah and the Savior, and it got quite heated. And Whoopi Goldberg, of all people, had to jump in to kind of quell that. They weren't the only ones capitalizing on this discussion about Trump and apparently a picture, a meme of him. Does he look like Jesus or was it a doctor? Iran, the Iranian propaganda machine, coming out with their own memes and has come out with a video which shows Jesus himself, or the person, however you depict him to be, actually grabbing Trump, punching him in the nose, and throwing him into hell. So I'll tell you what, as Donald Trump is famous for, he can get discussions going. And you know what, folks? At the end of the day, as the dust settles, maybe not a bad idea that like the whole world is talking about Jesus. Think about that, go into your day and enjoy. Keep the comments coming in. We'll catch you tomorrow.